This recording will look at the intrinsic and extrinsic regulation of the heart. First, we're going to look at intrinsic regulation. What intrinsic regulation means is that the heart itself is going to regulate its heart rate without any external influence. External influence will be that of the nervous system or of hormones. So this is regulation by the heart without the influence of the nervous system or hormones. So intrinsic regulation looks at how the heart responds to changes in blood volume and how that those changes in blood volume are going to affect heart rate and stroke volume. This is also looking at how the heart responds at changes in systemic blood pressure. So changes in blood volume and changes in systemic blood pressure. So the heart can adjust to changes in blood volume that can be brought about by things like exercise or dehydration or overhydration, anything that increases blood volume. The heart will respond to an increase in blood volume by increasing the force of contraction and the cardiac output. When there is an increase in blood volume, the condition is called preload, an increase in preload. The preload is the volume of blood that arrives at the right atria. So an increase in preload, an increase in the volume of blood that arrives at the right atria can be due to exercise, for example. So exercise can increase the preload of the heart. Again, the preload is the volume of blood that arrives at the right atria. So exercise can increase the preload. How does the heart respond when there is an increase in the blood volume in the right atrium, which is to say an increase in the preload? Increasing the preload is going to increase the end diastolic volume. So it's going to increase the volume of blood that arrives at the ventricle. And so the total volume of blood at the ventricle at the end of ventricular diastole will be increased. So that will be an increase in EDV. So end diastolic volume. The increase in blood is going to stretch the ventricular walls. The response to the stretch in the ventricular wall, so the muscles of the heart will be stretched, and that will send a response to the heart, that will send a signal to the heart to increase contractility, so to contract with more force, which is going to cause a greater stroke volume. So it's going to, the increase in the force of contraction will result in more blood being pumped out of the ventricles. This is called the Starling law of the heart, and it's often described as more volume in, more volume out. So the more volume of blood we put into the heart is stretched. The response to stretching the muscle is a stronger force of contraction, which pumps more blood out of the heart. So the heart can adjust to greater volumes of blood that arrive, an increase in venous return, for example, due to exercise, as an example, which causes an increase in the preload. Increasing the preload increases the end diastolic volume. Increasing the end diastolic volume stretches the walls of the ventricles and causes an increase in the force of contraction. Again, this is called the Starling law of the heart. More volume in, more volume out. The increased force of contraction increases stroke volume, which in turn results in an increase in cardiac output. Because if you remember, cardiac output is measured as the heart rate times the stroke volume. This is a direct relationship between stroke volume and cardiac output. As we increase the stroke volume, we're going to increase the cardiac output. And this in turn is going to increase MAP, which means the mean arterial pressure, the amount of blood that arrives and irrigates tissues. So this means that the heart can adjust the force of contraction to accommodate a larger volume of blood. So that's why this is called the intrinsic heart regulation, because there is no input from the nervous system or from hormones. Another condition that can affect stroke volume is what we call the afterload. The afterload is the force or the pressure that the left ventricle has to exert on the aortic semilunar valve in order to open it and pump blood into the aorta. Remember that in order to pump the blood out, the ventricle has to push the blood against the blood that is already in the aorta and against the pressure that blood creates in the aorta. If the pressure in the aorta rises above 170 millimeters of mercury, the force of the contraction in the ventricles will not be enough to open the semilunar valves. So the increase in afterload will prevent ventricles from opening semilunar valves and pumping enough blood out of the heart. The greater the force the ventricle must exert to open the aortic semilunar valve, the longer it takes to open the valve, the shorter the length of time left to pump blood out, resulting in a decrease in stroke volume. So remember that this is happening during ventricular systole, when the ventricles are contracting. And initially, in early ventricular systole, the semilunar valves are closed. So if this is the left ventricle, and this is the aorta, the semilunar valves are closed. There is blood and blood pressure, therefore, in the aorta, and the ventricle is having to contract and put force against that blood pressure in order to open the semilunar valves. The longer it takes during ventricular systole to open the valves, the less time there will be for the stroke volume, for the pumping of the blood out of the ventricle. So remember that ventricular systole lasts a certain amount of time. And if too much of that time is spent trying to open the doors, there's less time for blood to be pumped out of the ventricle. So that's going to decrease the stroke volume. So the afterload decreases stroke volume. Essentially what it's saying is that a high blood pressure in the aorta will prevent the ventricles from opening the semilunar valves for a long period of time, and therefore the stroke volume is going to decrease. An increase in afterload happens as we age, the aorta becomes stiffer and it cannot recoil to accommodate changes in blood pressure. Therefore, the pressure in the aorta increases, and that increases the afterload. So as we age and the pressure in the aorta increases, the afterload increases, stroke volume decreases. In decreasing stroke volume, we're also going to decrease the cardiac output, which is going to decrease the mean arterial pressure. So, high blood pressure increases afterload, which results in a decrease in stroke volume, which results in a decrease in cardiac output, which results in a decrease in MAP. So the end result is tissues are less irrigated with blood. So you should know what is the preload, how can preload increase, and what is the effect of the preload on contractility, stroke volume, and cardiac output. And remember, more in, more out is the starting law of the heart. Conversely, you should know what is the afterload of the heart. How does the afterload affect the stroke volume and cardiac output?